Well, I started off by saying that African development in the last 2 decades has been characterized by two contradictory elements. You've had in many countries a reduction in extreme poverty. This has been driven by rising commodity prices, better macroeconomic conditions, but you haven't had the kind of structural transformation that you need to transit to middle and high income economies, okay, which happen to countries in Asia and Latin America. And this is really where the change is. We need to focus on that. We need to develop our comparative advantage. We need to move from the primary sector to the secondary sector, increase the rate of industrialization and urbanization.
Okay, so you spoke about the importance of good governance and transparency, and how that impacts, economies generally. I'd like you to shed more light on that.
Well, the point I was making was I looked at the countries in Africa that have the highest ratios of revenue to GDP. And these are also the countries that seem to be faring very well on the Transparency International Corruption Perception Index. If you take out South Sudan, which is in that list, okay, and South Sudan is largely because the revenues come from oil and the GDP is very small. Okay, so it's not as if it's increasing non-oil revenues. Now, you look at the countries that are doing very poorly on that index and also doing poorly on revenue to GDP. So clearly, even by looking, you can see a link. And you can understand this. I mean, obviously, a transparent system that has less corruption is one that will make sure that you collect the taxes from people, make sure the taxes actually get into the government's pockets, and you do not have all these leakages. And therefore, improving transparency and public financial management is critical to improving revenues.
So when you look at countries and how they prioritize their national budgets, what's your biggest worry on how this impacts industrialization?
I think that we can read from the budgets of countries where the priorities are. Some of these things are voluntary, some of them are involuntary. So I give the example of my country where constitutionally we must have a president and a vice president and at least 36 ministers. We must have 109 senators, over 360 members of the House of Reps, governors, deputy governors, commissioners, advisors, chairman of local government, and so on. And whether or not the president likes it, he's got to fund this structure. So you've got a constitution that already gives us a high cost of governance with a substantial part of revenue going to pay salaries of public sector workers. Now, that does not give you enough money for industry. So you've got to address that. I've also looked at some of the deliberate policy decisions that have been taken, such as the continuation of this fuel subsidy, where you're spending ₦1 trillion to 1.4 trillion in a number of years on petroleum subsidies. Imagine what you could do with that, how many refineries you would build, how many power plants you could build, how much you could fix on your transmission. So we need to decide for ourselves and understand that for every dollar we spend, we have made a choice. We need to decide what is our priority. And if we make industrialization our priority, we can free up resources from some of these areas and put them into these areas. So even before we talk about increasing the tax base, okay, by simply improving the transparency of collecting what we are supposed to collect, and also improving the allocative efficiency of what we collect, we can make a great impact. And then we can look at other things. Your excise duty, customs duty are also affected by your trade policies. If you choose to have a high tariff on, say, rice, and your neighbors don't have a high tariff, and your borders are not sealed, you'll get rice in Nigeria anyway. They'll come in through Cotonou. So what's happening is that we're diverting imports and customs revenue to neighboring countries. If you choose to sell your foreign exchange at a discount of 20–30%, that is money that you're losing, that you leave on the table, because you know that you could get much more for your dollars than you're actually selling. So some of those policies are being addressed, some of them need to be addressed, but these are all areas where you can begin to unlock revenues and put into industrialization. And then finally, look at things like your VAT, look at your Cashless Nigeria project to make sure that you bring more and more of the informal sector into the financial system using POSs, and then leverage that to get the information that you need to collect the taxes.
Okay, so now I'd like you to speak to private capital and how, that whole ecosystem, the governments, the venture capitalists, people who are investors, how that interplays to driving industrial growth.
Capital, there is a surplus of capital in the world, which is why you've had many, many years of very low interest rates. There's a savings glut. Okay, but the reason you've got so much capital is that it's looking for outlets. Now, those outlets are only going to come when the government begins to address the risks associated with investments by dealing with externalities and coordination problems. And as I said, if you want someone to come in and invest in a garment factory, well, fix his other issues. Make sure you give him electricity, give him the roads, give him the security, give him the infrastructure. And then he invests and sets up, because he's a garment maker, it's not a power plant. And by coming together, identifying growth areas, and then sitting with the private sector and saying, what do you want us to do for you as a government? So you don't force them to internalize all those externalities. I mean, Aliko Dangote has done it, and the Dangote Group, but apart from him, very few people can do it. I don't know anybody else who can do it. And unless you want to have only one group be your manufacturing company, you've got to address those externalities.